I want to talk about the cost of this war to Americans, to the United States, because one obvious difference, and I think non-trivial difference, between the Vietnam War and the Iraq War on the one hand and the war in Ukraine, at least so far, is that 60,000 American lives were lost in the Vietnam War. Thousands of American lives were lost in the war in Iraq, as well as in Afghanistan. At least so far, there are no combat troops on the ground in Ukraine. There probably are boots on the ground, but just not combat boots. But there don't seem to be many, if any, American casualties in the Russia-Ukraine war thus far, despite how involved we are there. And that creates a perception, I think, that the cost is not really significant. Yes, we're spending $100 billion or so and counting on what's been authorized. But I want to ask you about the cost beyond just the financial cost, in particular, the reaction of the rest of the world to American and what it's doing to American standing. I don't know if you saw that there was a speech, I think about 10 days ago, by Fiona Hill, who's a longtime national security advisor and DC insider, a super hawk on Russia and China. She was aligned with John Bolton in the Trump administration. And she gave a speech warning Western elites that even though she doesn't agree with it, that the rest of the world, what we used to call the rest of the world, that is now basically the world, is uniting against this idea that the United States can just go everywhere and try and dictate wars with its superior national force. And in particular, they're uniting in a lot of ways behind China. Here in Brazil, for example, that has a history of very harmful U.S. interference that people to this day resent. President Lula, Brazil is the sixth largest country in the world, talks often about how he dreams of de-dollarization. He's clearly trying to bring Brazil closer to China and away from the U.S. China was able to march into the region we used to dominate in the Middle East while we're focused on Ukraine and forge this peace deal between the Saudis and the Iranians without us. All throughout Africa, the same thing. So can you talk about what, you're saying, you're describing this resentment that other people in the world have. For a long time, that resentment couldn't express itself because we were so dominant that it really didn't matter how much they resented us. What is now the effect on U.S. standing, and what are the other costs to Americans from this proxy war that we're seemingly engaged in without end?
Well, let me just tell you first, Glenn, what I think is happening here. I think two things are happening. One is that there has been a major shift in the global balance of power. As you said, for a long time, we were just so powerful, we could think that we could run around the world dictating the way people should behave. That world has gone away. The unipolar moment has given way to multipolarity. And we now have three great powers in the system, not only the United States, but also China and Russia. So the fact that the global balance of power has shifted diminishes our influence. But the second thing is, when you talk about soft power, our ability to use our ideology to influence people in positive ways, to try and sell liberal democracy in subtle ways, to portray the United States as a benign force in the world. We used to be very good at that. And we've lost that skill in major league ways. And the end result is that we look very heavy-handed. People all over the planet think that the United States behaves like a thug most of the time. So you have these two factors that are at work here. One is that in terms of hard power, the balance is shifted against us. And two, in terms of soft power, we don't look very good at all. So this has caused us all sorts of problems. And what are the consequences, you ask, for the United States? The consequences are quite serious here. If you look at what's happening in the Middle East, all sorts of countries are now cozying up to the Chinese and to the Russians, and they're basically giving the United States the finger when it asks for assistance. The Saudis have basically rejected a number of important pleas that President Biden has made to them regarding oil production. And the Saudis are cozying up to the Chinese. We're beginning to lose influence in all sorts of places at a time where we really need influence. So there are real costs associated with the fact that we behave in such a heavy-handed way. There are real costs associated with the fact that the United States had sanctions on well over 50% of the countries in the world. Eventually, this is going to come back to bite you in the hiney, and that's what's happening here.
So let me ask you about your article and some of the specific claims of it. It's entitled "The Darkness Ahead, Where the Ukraine War is Headed," and that title very vividly signifies the kind of pessimism that pervades your article, though I hope everybody will read it despite that kind of grim picture that you painted. And one of the principal arguments you make is that you say, first, is a meaningful peace agreement possible? My answer is no. Now, obviously, when a war like this, it's now almost a full year and a half that it is ongoing, not counting what happened before 2022 of February when the Russians invaded, when there was still kind of this lower level conflict, since at least 2014 between the separatists of eastern Ukraine and the central Kiev government, backed by East and West. But in terms of just this war itself, we're now almost a year and a half into it, and usually people will start wondering, especially when it seems to be some kind of a stalemate or like there's no military victory for a long time into the future, they start asking about diplomacy, and there doesn't seem to be any efforts toward that meaningfully, and you're here to say a meaningful peace agreement is now not possible. Why isn't it?
Well, there are two sets of reasons. First of all, at a very general level, it's important to understand that Russia views what's going on in Ukraine and what the United States is doing as an existential threat. On the other hand, the Ukrainians and the United States both view what Russia is doing in Ukraine as an existential threat. And when you have a situation where the two rival sides, the Russians on one side and the Ukrainians and the United States on the other, view the rival as an existential threat and are committed to defeating that rival, it's very hard to see how you can work out a deal short of one side defeating the other side. So that's point number one. Point number two is that there are two issues that are of immense importance that you are not going to be able to get agreement on, in my opinion. The first is territory, and the second is the issue of Ukrainian neutrality. First, on territory, the Russians have now conquered about 23% of Ukraine as it existed before the crisis started in 2014. So the Russians have taken about 23% of Ukraine, and they're intending to take more territory. The Russians are not going to give back that territory. They have made that very clear. And in fact, they have annexed the 23% that they have now taken. They have made it part of Russia and said it's not going back to Ukraine. Ukraine says, we want that territory back, and we won't stop fighting until the territory is returned to us. You can certainly understand the Ukrainian position, but you can understand the Russian position as well. So the question is, how do you square that circle? And the answer is you don't. Then the next big issue is the issue of neutrality. Really, what this war is all about is that the Russians did not want Ukraine to be a Western bulwark on Russia's border. Most importantly, the Russians did not want Ukraine in NATO. They wanted Ukraine to be neutral. Well, Ukraine doesn't want to be neutral. Ukraine wants to be in NATO. And at this point in time, and for the foreseeable future, Ukraine is joined at the hip with the West. So it's got no interest whatsoever in neutrality. And from the Russian perspective, neutrality is essential. The Russians will not accept Ukraine in NATO. So when you take these two particular issues, the territory issue and the neutrality issue, and you marry them together with the fact that you have two rivals here that both view the other side as an existential threat that has to be defeated, I think it's almost impossible to imagine how you're going to get some sort of diplomatic deal.
Here's what I genuinely don't understand, and I'd love to hear your insight into this, which is your views for a long time were kind of the prevailing views in Washington with regard to the question of Ukraine and Russia. There's that memo that we've now all seen written by the current CIA director, Bill Burns, in 2008 when the Bush administration was talking about the possibility of expanding NATO up to the Russian border, including Ukraine. That was something Condoleezza Rice was talking about. And he wrote a memo, I believe, to Condoleezza Rice in which he said, look, I've spent a lot of time in Moscow, and it isn't just Putin and his loyalists, but even anti-Putin liberals. For every single person in Russian politics, regardless of where they fall on the spectrum, NATO membership for Ukraine is a red line. That is something that if we even think about doing, we will absolutely provoke the Russians into a military conflict. And it's insane for us to do because we have no sufficient interest in Ukraine to justify that kind of a risk of confrontation with Russia directly or indirectly. President Obama, every time he was pressed by neocons, including on the way out in 2016 when he was interviewed by Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, who complained that he didn't do more to confront the Kremlin in places like Syria and even in Ukraine, where he didn't want to flood Ukraine with lethal weapons. President Obama's argument was, we don't have any vital interest in Ukraine. Certainly not sufficient to go to war with Russia or risk a conflict with Russia over who governs eastern Ukraine. All of that is gone. There's just no more restraint at all about the idea about having Ukraine be a Western puppet, about flooding Ukraine with weapons. That's obviously something that we're doing. And now the people who have that view, like you, are considered so marginalized that you're basically a traitor. What changed in Washington so quickly that caused the United States to start seeing this conflict in a much different way that at least a lot of members of the foreign policy establishment used to see it for a long time?
Just to embellish your point a bit, Glenn, if you go back to the 1990s, when the big debate about whether to have any NATO expansion was conducted, there were a large number of people in the foreign policy establishment, including President Clinton's Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, who were adamantly opposed to NATO expansion because they said it would lead to disaster, that it would lead to a situation like the one we're facing in Ukraine. So it's not like my view is such a unusual view.
Exactly.
There were many people who argument. And one more case or one more example to highlight this, and this is my favorite example, is that the decision to bring Ukraine into NATO was made in April 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit. And at that summit, both Angela Merkel, who was the German chancellor at the time, and the French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, were opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. And Angela Merkel has since said that the reason that she was opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO is that she believed that Putin would interpret it as a declaration of war. Just think about that. Angela Merkel said she thought that NATO expansion into Ukraine would be interpreted by Putin as a declaration of war, which of course is what happened. But what Angela Merkel was saying, and what all of those individuals who opposed NATO expansion in the 1990s were saying, is the same thing I've been saying since 2014. But as your question points out, something has happened to change things. And what's happened is that we're now in this war. And the big question on the table that will be the big question moving forward is who has blood on their hands? In other words, the question is who is responsible for this disaster? And my view is, and I believe this is Angela Merkel's view, and I believe this is the view of the people in the 1990s who were saying it would lead to disaster. Our view is that it's the foreign policy establishment that pushed NATO expansion to include Ukraine that is responsible for this disaster, that has blood on its hands. They don't want to hear that argument. They, meaning people in the foreign policy establishment. And of course, they view me as a mortal enemy because I am in effect saying they are responsible for this disaster. But the fact is that, in my opinion, as time goes by, more and more people will recognize that the foreign policy establishment of the United States, to include virtually every administration since the Clinton administration, is responsible for producing what's going on in Ukraine today.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same history with all these conflicts where they begin and they get 70% of Americans and the establishment wings of both parties on board, and within however long, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, people come to regard it as, oh, it's a huge mistake, we shouldn't have done it, and then it's on to the next war. And that, I agree, will be the trajectory here. I just want to push a little bit more on the reason for this change in the perspective. Like I said, it was President Obama as late as 2016 saying we have no vital interest in Russia. It's insane to go to risk war with Russia over things like who governs the Donbass. Something has changed. My hypothesis, and I'm interested in your view, is that one of the major reasons is that you alluded to Russiagate earlier. And one of the reasons I was so concerned about and opposed to Russiagate from the beginning wasn't just because it was a baseless hoax that came from the CIA against the Trump administration that they regarded as enemy. My much bigger concern was the geopolitical implications, that it was creating this atmosphere in Washington where no one could even speak to Russian officials without being suspected of some kind of disloyalty or treason. Michael Flynn almost went to prison because he picked up the phone before he became the national security advisor and called the Russian ambassador. And it created this climate where Americans were feeding on this anti-Russian hatred over the fact that they were told that the reason Hillary Clinton lost and Donald Trump won was because of Putin and the Kremlin. Now, maybe it's a chicken and egg thing. Maybe the reason the intelligence community disseminated Russiagate was because they wanted to become more adversarial to Russia, and it was a way of getting public opinion on their side. Maybe Russiagate just caused this and caused a lot of Democrats to start seeing the Kremlin in a much different way. But I'm wondering, A, if you think that's part of it, and B, what is the cause of why just the entire foreign policy community has given up on these longstanding principles that for a long time you were kind of on board with, you were still on board with, but it's now nowhere to be found among them?
I think there's no question that the whole Russiagate business and the ensuing Russophobia does matter here. I think there's no question about that. I think that explains a good deal of the support for Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting against the evil Russians. And it's not only the Russophobia, it's the antagonism towards Putin. I mean, I sometimes refer to it as the Hitlerization of Vladimir Putin. It's really quite remarkable, the extent to which he is sort of personified as the devil incarnate. You don't have to like Vladimir Putin. You can be highly critical of him. But the idea that he's the second coming of Adolf Hitler is not a serious argument. But many people make that argument. And I think that, just going back to the 2016 election, I think many people believe that, especially in the Democratic Party, that there's no way that Donald Trump could have beaten Hillary Clinton without outside interference. Just impossible. Candidate in their mind, and she should have won, period. And the fact she didn't is due to outside interference, and in particular to Russian interference. And I don't think, Glenn, there's any amount of evidence that you can bring to bear to convince a lot of people who have that worldview that it just doesn't hold water, that it's wrong. And they therefore continue to loathe the Russians because they blame the Russians, and Vladimir Putin in particular, for Donald Trump, even though there is no evidence to support that. Trump beat Clinton because Trump was a better candidate, whether you like it or not. But there are lots of people who just don't accept that. And a lot of those people are fervently behind the war in Ukraine. I think the polls show that Democrats are more hawkish on Ukraine than Republicans are. You can see some cracks in the Republican edifice. You don't see hardly any cracks in the democratic edifice. And I think that gets back to the general point that you're making about Russiagate in the 2016 election.
Yeah, you know, one thing that's amazing is if you look back over the last 20 years, there is almost a countless number of foreign leaders that Washington decided it wanted to go to war with or otherwise undermine, who have been compared to Hitler or even called worse than Hitler. That was something Michael McFaul tried not to apologize for when he was trying to say Putin was not only as bad as Hitler, but even worse because at least Hitler didn't kill ethnic Germans. You know, you have Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad and Muammar Gaddafi, all of whom have been accused in mainstream venues of being the new Hitler, because obviously that's a very powerful way to get Americans to support a war.